Namaste. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alina, and together with Joel, we will be hosting this evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Joel.
Namaste, Alina. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste.
Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Happy to be with you.
We are happy to continue our weekly session, which is streamed online. And today we are in the middle of this very important discussion on the purification of the mind and the intelligence. This is a fascinating topic with implications in our daily life. And we will continue on this also today, entering in greater details. And we invite Sraddhalu to open this session.
In studying Sri Aurobindo, it is often useful to read generally to get the big picture, and then to review, to go in depth, to go deeper into the understanding, because now you have a reference, and then as you go deeper, you do not lose the larger picture of that deeper study. We've actually been through, I think, 3 sessions in which we have dwelt on this particular aspect of the purification. And the last 2 sessions in particular dwelt on the aspect of the purification of the sense mind and then the Buddhi, which was the special focus last time. In this, just to recapitulate, we have gone deep into the psychology that Sri Aurobindo presents, where he completely reverses the basis of reality. We are spiritual beings. We are infinite. We are eternal. We are blissful Satchidananda, who have taken on the experience of a mental life and a physical life. And this changes everything. It also makes that the whole evolutionary process is the development of our vehicles through which we can manifest, not only experience these ranges of reality, but act in them. And for which, therefore, the means, the instruments, the tools also have to be made commensurate to the consciousness which they have to manifest. And so everything has to be lifted up and transformed into its divine image, or become a vehicle for the divine action in its purity, in its clarity, without distortion, without limiting. And is this even possible? And because we understand that the lower ranges are actually reduced versions of the higher ranges, in a sense, a reflection, something of the higher is implied in them and even present at a deeper, as a deeper base. Therefore, that thing activated can open and transform and make an instrument of the infinite, infinite appearance, make an instrument of the eternal in time, and make an instrument of the divine bliss into this play of multifaceted forms and appearances. In all this, we have seen certain early stages of preparation, and we have now been focusing on the aspect of purification, understanding the true nature of purification, which is not moral or ethical, but removal of distortions. And there are 2 distortions. Sri Aurobindo went to the root of the question. The first distortion is our evolution having taken place in ignorance and limitation and duality. We are distorted at every step in our normal habitual way of being into that ignorance and duality. And so letting go of those habitual forms to allow for a higher influence to fill and create new rhythms would be the correction there. The second distortion is the impurity born from the process of evolution, where each higher has emerged from a lower. And to that extent is as if formed of the lower, or even when it comes into its own, dependent on the lower functioning. It's as if from childhood, because you grew up as a little baby, You held back the baby style of being, even into your adulthood. So if you were crawling on four limbs, well, as an adult, you continue to crawl on four limbs. Doesn't make sense. You're supposed to stand up and walk, isn't it? And the same thing happens with the mind. If as a baby you had a brain which was half the size of what it is, well, you can't keep that half size. It has to grow, it has to change. But in this case, the change in consciousness is something far more radical and more difficult for us initially because we're simply not conscious. All this is like a quick summary of the picture. Sri Aurobindo went in depth into the psychology of the physical body, the subtle mental body, and how these two influence the prana acting between them, the layers of the mind itself. You will recall the technical terms in Sanskrit, the stuff of consciousness, which is called chitta, the sense mind, which is called manas, and the intelligence and will together combined, which is called buddhi. Now, this vocabulary we have seen is common in the yoga tradition, but Sri Aurobindo goes into details which are required because there is a transformation of these powers. And so those details are critical for our understanding, but also for the practice. Now, so far, we had seen what we needed to do in a very general way. I propose that today we enter into the practical aspect of how we do those things. How do we actually become conscious of these parts and so on? Since our goal is to, or rather, nature's goal in us is to empower us as Purusha, in the awakening of the Buddhi particularly, to understand, possess, and master her. You will recall this discussion last time. For those of you who may not have seen those, I would highly recommend that you see those before continuing with this, but this can stand on its own as a discussion. Now, if you have, over the last few weeks and perhaps even a couple of months, if you have worked on what we discussed as exercises for developing equality, for bringing a basic calm in the mind, for developing the detachment, bringing down peace into the mind, and so on, what we will do today as exercises will be that much easier. But even if you have not done that, the exercises will be not difficult, and it will be interesting because nowhere in our current education are we actually made to introspect in this way, to observe the actual functioning of the mind. This is something so essential if you are to master mind. You have to be able to observe what's happening within you. You have to be able to observe how the emotions rise and cloud the thinking, how these mix, how the thought process is subverted constantly by your expectations, by your desires, by your habits, by your sense of reality as being formed of opposites. Just that is enough to distort in such a way that we do not even realize, we are not even conscious. Any introspection that we are made to do, even in spiritual traditions, is generally to observe how the emotions behave or how the thought goes, only with the intention of stilling it, but not the actual process of thinking itself by which you can purify and make it more perfect. You don't find that in any traditions that, at least I have not seen that in any traditions. So we will do a little bit of this exercise with some interesting triggers. The first point you will recall, Sri Aurobindo says that you have to distinguish between the manas and the buddhi, that is the sense mind and the independent power of intellect, thought, and will. Now, I will avoid using the word intellect, or when I use it, I will use it generally as meaning buddhi, because in the English language, intellect is just a blur of all these different layers mixed together with some thinking capacity. So you could actually say with that animals have a certain crudely formed intellect, but for this purpose, we have to distinguish these layers. So separating manas from buddhi, sense mind is that part of your awareness which plugs through your senses, looks at the world, And only the reality of what the senses show you is your reality. So the classic example in yoga tradition is of late evening, in twilight, you see a rope on the ground. The first association of a rope which is in a wavy line is it a snake? And then the emotional disturbance associated with the word snake, the agitation of the life force within the nerves, makes it seem as if the snake is moving or the rope is moving. You see, you will observe when you see very carefully an object, especially in dim light. If you're agitated emotionally, energetically, or even some kind of fear is there, you will see the form waving, moving. Interesting. Notice how the nervous energies mixing into emotions and then mixing into senses and mind make for this. And with it, the agitated, hasty response, it's a snake, what do I do? But if the part of the buddhi sticks out a little bit, free of the sense mind, it'll stop. Is it actually a snake or is it just the haze and I'm not seeing clearly? And it will will your emotions to become quiet. It will will your senses to become still so that you can watch carefully. No, it's not really moving. It seems to be a rope. You see, this ability of this part that sticks out to stand back and modify is not normally used. We don't live in it. It only pops up when surprised in the sense mind. So being able to differentiate these two allows us then to consciously be able to pull out this part which stands back from the sense mind and can actually judge looking for a deeper or higher truth. Now, if I, as an experiment, if I take this little coin and I hold it in my hand with the intention that we will do something with it as an experiment. So I will squeeze it now and press it down, and you can feel when I press hard enough, it's literally as if my hand becomes red, and then I squeeze until the coin seems to dissolve. It's a classic trick of a stage magician. If you observe the movement of what happened in your mind, the sense mind, and then the surprise of the sense mind, and then the intellect kicking in. Just observe. Maybe I'll take this occasion to ask Alina and Joel, what was your impression as you saw this coin vanishing? Could you see it melting? Literally, the sense mind gives you the sense as if you see the coin dissolving into the air.
Yes, it's very true, especially because the fingers were moving slowly, gently, squeezing. So it felt like, okay, it means you're going to move that coin somewhere, but...
And could you actually see it as if your mind was seeing the coin and then it vanished into thin air in the last movement like this? You had that feel?
Yes, that was the feeling. And it was dissolving.
The fact that you describe also orally what's happening, I'm totally convinced of it. Where is the coin, by the way?
It's gone. It's just been dissolved into thin air. And this is where the sense mind, you see, if you observe carefully, the sense mind saw the coin. And then as the fingers held and tightened, it's as if your eyes filled in the thinning of the coin. And if you observe in the memory, you will actually have the sense as if you saw the coin fizzle out into thin air. Now, at that moment, the sense mind was leading until its own leading led to a conclusion which didn't make sense to the senses. And there's a surprise. At that moment, the intellect kicks in. What happened? Where did it go? Did it go into his sleeves? No, it didn't go into sleeves. What happened? Where did it go? How did he do it? Now, if you observe this operation, it's very interesting to observe, and you can take a pause and review how this happened inside you. The intellect kicked in and questioned the sense mind because it knows it's not possible. Even the sense mind felt surprise. That's not what happens normally. That's not customary, which is what the sense mind is bound to. There's a very interesting video which is going on currently in what they call viral loop, where a person does this experiment of, well, a stage magic trick to make a coin disappear in front of a monkey. And the monkey is watching, first not very interested, and then when the coin vanishes, his eyes go wide, his mouth opens up, and it stares. And then it starts looking around. It's surprised. It doesn't know what to do. You see, that is where the power of the intellect, the buddhi, is kicking in, but it's not fully developed. But it knows something unusual has happened because it does not fit reality. And then the man does the magic again and reproduces the coin. And at that point, the monkey throws his head back, covers his mouth, and starts running around. It's very interesting to observe that response. It's in fact the same response in a human being, with some variations. So if you take a little child, I've seen a little child who was shown a trick where this person was holding a pen, and he held it, or he had it on the ground, and then he held his hand above and made the pen float up as if. And the child looked at the person surprised, and then there was fear, and she moved back. And the person tried to make friends. No, the child had decided this is a strange, dangerous person. Reality gets warped, so something weird. If you see also a baby's reaction when you show a picture of an object floating without a support, or there's an object with a support and someone removes the support and the object stays floating. Of course, it's supported from behind. But the child looks at it, surprised. It's a baby, by the way, who can hardly speak, 2 or 3 months. Looks at it and starts crying. The dissonance of reality in the sense mind's formation of what reality should be, and then what is shown by the actual senses. There's nothing in the sense mind in which this information can fit, provoking this higher power of the buddhi to stand back from the operation and say, what went wrong? Where did I go wrong? What is the correction I need to do? This is extremely important to observe because it's exactly what exists in animals. Only as adult humans, we have a more refined response. Perhaps we will laugh. I will discuss that also, how that comes in, and Sri Aurobindo describes those layers. Now, if you have distinguished what happened within you in the sense mind and the buddhi proper, which came in after, notice this layer. This is where we tend to live the bulk of our life. Think about it. And especially when we look towards some kind of entertainment, we wallow in this layer of the sense mind, manas. So if you're watching cinema, television, or mostly nowadays people watch on their WhatsApp groups, YouTube, TikTok, or whatever videos which are shown, watch what happens, the state of your mind. You fall into the sense mind in a kind of a passivity, just absorbing and allowing the play of emotions or sense-based thoughts with a little bit of trigger of unusual surprise, which may tickle the buddhi, the power of intelligence. But the will is passive. There's no action. When you're going to sit down to watch a movie, you'll see people when they go into a movie theater, you buy a pile of popcorn. When you come out, you finished it, but you were not conscious while you were eating. You were just popping it in, eating, drinking. And it was all a sense-based experience. The element of intellect was triggered at best if there was an element of surprise in the movie or some mystery, a puzzle, and that's about it. I'll show you how you could reverse that. You can engage the intellect, the buddhi. So there's intelligence and will, but we are still using primarily the intelligence. The will aspect will be left in the mind, not in external action. You observe, why did the camera move this way? What is the effect that it had on you? Notice how when the person became very emotional, the camera was slowly zooming on the face and then the tears formed. And you notice what effect it has on you. Had the camera stayed static, there would not be this amplification of intensity of emotion. Observe. Notice how the director or the editor switched between 2 different lines of the storytelling. leaving you hanging on one line while it caught up on the second line, then brought you back on the first, leaving you hanging on the second at some critical point. And that's how they build and hold interest, observe. And so the entire play is not an immersion in the flow of events of the senses, but a standing back to observe how the flow of events is arranged and how your responses are modified by those events. Watch a movie like this entirely. It's a fascinating experience. And especially if you do it with a movie that you've already seen before, that you have liked in particular. Now you'll see why you liked it or how you were made to like it. Interesting. Or if you could get hold of some of the DVDs, nowadays it's difficult to find a DVD, but in the old days you would get a DVD with a director's commentary track. That was like a bonus. So you watch the movie, then second time you play it and switch the track to the director's commentary. And the director is saying, so as we were developing this scene, we were thinking this and that. You don't hear the music or the sound of the actual actors. It's just the director's commentary, or maybe you hear a little bit of the movie. But the director's voice is explaining, pointing out, and what were the options? How did it? What was the intention of showing it in this way? What was the effect that he intended on you? At that point, you'll notice the identification that you have with the movie players is completely gone. That was natural to the sense mind. That is not natural to the intelligence, the pure Buddhi. The Buddhi wants to, always does, tend to stand back. And so you watch the same movie with the director's commentary. It's fascinating. I believe you will find on YouTube now some of the movies shown with director's comments also. But as an exercise, when you do this, you see your relationship with this movie change. That is exactly the poise the Buddhi has within you in relation to sense mind and its knowledge and habits. Observe this and consciously separate yourself more and more in the Buddhi by this movement of leaning back, which we have already referred to many times. You see the actors crying, but you're not identified with the emotion. You're thinking, this was a very good acting. How did she manage to get the tears? And how interestingly the camera moved at that point and switched to provoke such and such a response, and so on. It's a meta level of appreciation, a higher level of appreciation and a higher level of enjoyment, which is not sentimental and emotional at all. It is a pure mind enjoyment, mind delight, which may reflect in the emotions secondarily. As an exercise, it is something so valuable. I will highly recommend for you to attempt this. Next, as an exercise, practically, to enter into pure operation of Buddhi, you take a video in which there is a technical explanation for a new concept. Now, if you take a normal educational video, concepts are rare. Vocabularies are common. Here, this is this, and this is named this, that is called that, and you're given a vocabulary. But to get actually to a concept of something fundamentally different, wow, that's a completely different way of looking at it. This thing exists as an idea in itself. You could look at some of the MIT videos on physics, for example, and while they're very well made, very conceptually oriented, and when you find a good presenter presenting this, you're literally made to rise in your mind's operation to a new level. Very detached, looking for fundamental, essential truths. And this training to shift into that, because the video requires you to shift, is very useful. You will find after a while, initially, the brain tires. Okay, that's too much. I can't take in more. Fine, you pause. Then come back later after a few hours or a few days. Doesn't matter. But work on it in this way until the state of that pure conceptual poise is distinctly enough felt that you can shift from there into your earlier state and back. This power of being able to shift levels is a great liberator. It was a comment that the mother made. Now, I don't remember to whom it was, that perhaps it was to Vasanti. no, or to Narad, where she said, you must learn how to rise from level to level, from plane to plane. And that is shifting the level of consciousness like this. And you should be able to also come back all the way to replug into the sense mind and experience how limiting it is, and then shift back up. And as you move back and forth, you are as if forming a continuity in consciousness. We will discuss further the 3 levels within the Buddhi itself. But for now, just recognize this. And then in the sense mind, there's a part which turns purely to the physical senses. And then there's a part which bypasses physical senses. So you remember an event which took place elsewhere, or you imagine what might be happening right now somewhere else. And it's still a sensory plug-in, but not physical senses, but your subtle senses or your imagination, or a memory of the senses. But now distinguish between the physical senses and this layer. So Sri Aurobindo gives this a very interesting observation. Manas, he says, the sense mind, is actually a development of the external turned consciousness, chitta. By excitation of external contacts, the sense of manas, which needs to organize these contacts, now begins to form. Now, this is how it took place in evolution, but this is how it continues to take place in us. The triggers of the physical senses trigger the sense mind to come into its own. And in the same way, in the sense mind, when there is a complete contradiction of sensory perception, it triggers the buddhi, intelligence and will, to rise up. So observe this and distinguish. Now, he also explains how the mental contact with the senses, with the physical objects outside you, let's say, is forming by this double mix we discussed last time briefly, the physical nervous impression of the object and the mental nervous value that we give to it. And the two together form the senses as an experience. And as a result, therefore, the working of your intelligence, of the buddhi, is constantly mixed in by these layers. Not only the sense mind, the sense mind's values to the sense objects, and in the physical nervous response values to the object. So I will give you a few examples of this. There's a second aspect. One is the knowledge as you perceive. The other is the action. So not only is the sense mind organizer of the sense experience, but it has also the aspect of natural reaction. Will in the embodied consciousness is the phrase that Sri Aurobindo uses, and it's there in all animals, including us, as part of our past evolution. And it uses the body as an organ of action. But this action also has a double element, he points out. There's a physico-nervous impulse, and behind it a mental nervous power value of instinctive will impulse. I've just read from Sri Aurobindo's text. So there's a physico-nervous impulse. First reaction, snake. That part was not in your control. It was almost instinctive. Then the mental power value. What do I do? What can I do? Where can I go? Is it safe? Is it not safe? Is it actually a snake when the buddhi comes in? But still, the first part is an instinctive will impulse. Move back, run away. When we interact with people, these elements all the time distort our perception of what's actually happening, equally our response to what is happening. For example, you meet somebody who is not well-dressed, who's smelling, or who's coarse or crude in appearance or behavior. The first thing you would feel is a disgust and a withdrawal. And you will judge the person by that. And that's one of the reasons why in circles of sophisticated behavior in business, the external appearance is considered so important. It's the first impression you create, and people live for the rest of their life by the first impression. I've seen this in myself, but equally in others. First impression gone wrong, it's taken weeks, months, sometimes years, and still the hanging first impression is there as, but I felt that in the first time, so after that I never felt it. What does it mean? I have not lost it, the first impression. That's the extent to which the intellect is compromised by this physico-nervous impulse and mental nervous power value that you give to the senses and the reaction that it caused in you. You will see, for example, when we took the example earlier of the monkey, mouth opening, hand covering, is all part of the physical response and mixed into it the mental value, the baby's reaction. Or as adult humans, when we are in a setting where somebody is performing on stage and makes the coin vanish, you say, wow, that excitation, enjoyment, laughter, surprise. In a changed context, the same thing would be fear. Interesting. You're given a safe space, safe context. You know this is going to be a stage magic act. You can laugh. The same thing happens in a different context. You might just have fear. So the important thing here is to recognize how all these lesser, lower levels are actually confusing, clouding, distorting the values of the pure Buddhi, the knowledge aspect of the intellect as well as the will aspect of the intellect are distorted by this. So Sri Aurobindo explains how left to itself, this whole development of the sense mind and its ability to engage would just make us nothing but thinking animals. The Buddhi itself is so subservient that you barely break out of this stream of flow of the sensations. And this is what you will see in a large part of humanity. There's a stream of sensations, emotions, and events, and they're flowing in it. Completely conditioned by the stream. This happens, they respond. That happens, they respond. All reactive. And you navigate the whole day. And it won't be an exaggeration to say for all of us, 90% of the day is in this category. Responding to external stimuli or even internal stimuli of associations. And that's it, we are in the stream. This ability to stand back is rarely used. And this we must consciously engage, develop, separate. Sri Aurobindo uses the words which make the human being separate from the animal. He uses this word, the ability to disengage, separate into his thought action from the sense mentality, to draw back, observe its data, and act on it from above by separated and partially freed intelligence. This is what makes us different. That's still not the full power of the Buddhi. The Buddhi is constantly being pulled back. And because of the habit of being embedded into the sense mind as well as the senses and those two layers of the senses, we don't even know what it's like to be fully free. So the Buddhi is warped by the habitual values of the sense mind. This is good, that is bad, that is comfortable, that is safe, and so on. The physical senses are also conditioning your intelligence and thought power. And one of the things you will see is any sudden action, cluck, cluck, move. Immediately your head turns, but also your thought turns. You'll say it's instinct, it's survival instinct. But the point is your power of intelligence was taken over by a simple act of a sudden sound or movement. Every day when I walk to the dining room to bring food, I see these sellers on the road. You know, with the tourists come the sellers around the ashram. And there's one of them. Inevitably, it makes the mind turn. I've consciously tried to hold back the physical reaction, but inevitably something of the mind at least moves. What he does, he sells leather belts. So he has got a whole pile of maybe 10 or 15 leather belts in his hand, which he waves. And then every now and then he flicks it and creates a whack. Sharp, clear, precise click sound. Loud. The whack taking place anywhere up to a distance of 100 meters is enough to do this instinctively. The turn, and with that, the mind turning. So I worked consciously to be able to free this physical movement, but something of the mind still goes momentarily and then comes back. It's that whack. Oh, it's that fellow. And that's it. It's interesting to see how deeply embedded the mixtures are. pulls attention, breaks the chain of thought. If I was thinking of something, whack, I come back, I don't know what I was thinking. I've lost the link. That means the thought itself was a wandering thought, not a clear, conscious thought. And I'm giving these examples because this is how you're going to consciously practice the separation of the buddhi from the sense mind. By observing in this way, introspecting, and then modifying the responses. When, as a child, I practiced the stage magic. It was one of the fun things that I had learned. And I still understand why it attracted me so much, because of the way it could play with the mind's perceptions. And there was one book which I found to be extraordinary. It's one of those very rare books. Everyone is teaching you tricks and techniques, but this one was a book on the psychology of stage magic. And it went into it in such depth. It is one of the most fascinating things I've read. It was explaining how shape and color are used to subtly modify the sense mind impression, and from there, the logical conclusion of your buddhi. So for example, you will have seen stage magicians. They will have a little box, very thin, flat, and then the magician comes and puts a cloth in front and then lifts the cloth, and there's a human being standing there. Generally, they put a woman. There's no way that woman could have fitted inside the box. It's so thin, so narrow, so light. And the man in the book, he explains how this is done. The legs of the box are made to be thin sticks. So you have a thin stick like that, slanted, 4 legs. If you had put thick, long, round legs, you would have got the impression that this is something holding heavy weight. You put thin, slanted legs, 4 of them, paint them brown. They look like thin, light balsa wood. And straight away, the sense mind informs the intelligence that this is light, this is hollow and empty. Then the shape itself of the box, instead of being square block, is made to be slanted edges. So when the edges taper, you see it from the edge, the impression is thin and narrow. And then the color, light brown, versus imagine if it was painted thick, heavy, dark colors, brown or metallic, you would have immediately got the sense of weight. Change the color, it becomes light. And remember, this is happening at the level of the physical sensory response, traveling all the way through the sense value put on the physical senses by the sense mind, then the sense mind's value plugging into the intelligence which says impossible, cannot be. But it has been so carefully, skillfully deceived just by the play of shape, color, to create the impression of weight or size, in this case to hide. And the warping of the reality that is caused by the sense mind convincing the buddhi that this is what it is. That warping of reality, when it is reversed, the surprise of magic takes place. How did he do it? It's impossible. There is no way they could have done it this way. So if you take this in a very practical sense and do this as an experiment, literally you visualize, let's say you visualize a circle here and start turning with your mind a form, create a form, visualize the shape of a coin, and then you try to hold it, feel it, and then slowly you form the coin right there on your hand. It's come back, what had dissolved into thin air. You see the way the sense mind was led. Surprise, it's come back. And yes, it is metal. Any comments? Joel, could you see that? Alina? How did it work in your layers of senses, sense mind, and intellect? Maybe I didn't do it too well, but whatever the impression you had.
Yeah, well, remain mysterious still.
Okay. But did you notice how literally your eyes were filling in the gap until suddenly you saw this shiny thing come out?
True.
Literally melts into your reality or coalesces into your reality.
That's true.
Alina, anything unusual? Okay, so as an experiment. I've used this only as an experiment to show you how this mixing of these layers takes place. Not only in perception, but even more so in your action. Now, if your perception was warped, your decisions will be wrong. But when you begin to act, at that moment in the action itself, there's a similar distortion taking place as the intention ripples through those layers. So I would even suggest, if you want to really play with this, you can watch videos of magic tricks. It's not so important how they did it. There's an entertainment value. So you watch how and separate the layers. First of all, the two sense layers. There is the physical registration, let's say the colors and what I was describing earlier, shape. And then how it evokes in the senses the sense of weight or size because of the way it has been arranged. And sometimes there is a glitzy, shiny, often on stage magic, they will use glitzy, shiny surfaces because they help to distract the senses. You see, if you have sparkling lights all over the place, your sense mind does not know where to focus. And that clouding, you observe how it senses, how it affects the intelligence. So separate these two layers of the sense operation and then observe the sense mind as it gives values or responses to each of those things. And then observe how your intellect proper as the Buddhi kicks in and how it modifies, it reviews, reshapes, recasts those values, tries to understand. Where a child would look at the magic trick and step back in fear, the adult will say, wow, what is that? Show me again. How did you do it? And that shows that the intellect, but still the intellect momentarily rising, it's still falling back into the sense mind's values. Show me how you did. Once I show you how you did, it's gone. What was the deeper value to the Buddhi proper? Rarely got a chance. I remember, because I like to do this, provoking the higher, let's say, impulses when I play with children. I will watch what is the current level of their, let's say, development in the levels of consciousness, and then nudge a little bit to the next level. And sometimes the children are surprised, oh yeah, and they engage on that level. Then I nudge a little more, and then there's a point where, oh, can't go much more because the mind or the physical brain is not yet ready. Some of them can go very far to the level of adult thought and even higher than adult thought because the mind is still open and inquisitive, not yet too formed in rigid grooves. So it's quite fascinating to see that. And you know those children will be very unusual and will be quite independent in their life. But when you observe like this, I sometimes use little magic tricks when I play with children. I recall one child who had seen a magic trick when he was 6 years old, coming back when he was 13 and saying, can you show me that? It means it touched something deep inside. It provoked some line of, let's say, awakening, which never left him. And that's interesting to observe. So this is just to suggest as one of the practices which you can do, watching, well, surprising events or watching a cinema, but with this intention of separating all these different layers, observing how they function within you. All of this will give you a subjective experience of separation between sense mind and Buddhi proper. Observe shift levels. You're here, shift levels. Now comes something very important. In your life, you will find yourself often slipping into emotional states. We often like to wallow in those emotions. I am feeling miserable. I am feeling unhappy. I am so excited. I want to maintain this excitement. I wish it'll never stop. You'll see that very commonly in others, in yourself. Notice how the need to wallow in that state tends to exaggerate, extend the state. If you're in a, let's say, disturbed state, you tend to want others to share in it as a way of expanding further beyond yourself, because after a while, you get bored with your own unhappiness or depression or worry. So you extend it to include others. They may or may not be so interested. Notice how at that point, if you could, you would have stayed on And either by exhaustion it ends or sudden change of environment. You have to go to work. You've been wallowing in self-pity. You go into your workspace and immediately your mood changes. Observe how that took place. If you're in your own space, wallowing in self-pity, and I say, pull yourself out of it, it's not worth it. I can't. It's too deep. It's too intense. I can't get rid of it. You enter your workspace and switch. It's gone. You are now fully focused in your external, objective life reality. Observe this. It's a very interesting change that takes place. And if you can catch how it's done, you will be able to master your emotions very easily. You come out of your workspace, you come back home or whatever your space for wallowing in self-pity was, and you tend to slide back. The mood comes back upon you. It's not reason. It's not buddhi. It's even a layer of sense mind, which is sensational, emotional. It's not even the logical sense mind. And it sucks you, it pulls you into itself. Again, a sharp change, you step out, you have to engage in some work, or a phone call comes from workspace. By the way, we have this problem. Can you solve it? Your tone changes immediately. You don't pick up the phone to your boss and say, I am so miserable. You say, yes, sir. What switched? You could not have done yes, sir, at just a moment ago. Observe internally. It's not a question of explaining with thoughts. It's a question of becoming aware. What shifted? Who shifted? Shifted from what to what? Observe. The familiarity of awareness is your key. Now, before your boss calls, you're wallowing in self-pity. You say, I've enjoyed my self-pity enough. Now I want to get out of it. How do I do that? Imagine, what if your boss calls? What will you do? You shift. That's it. You just broke out of it instantly by free choice. Observe this capacity because it's already there within us. It's just we allow ourselves to be sucked and choose to wallow. We can choose to disengage. And this we choosing is again a part of the buddhi. But we will see in the buddhi itself the 3 layers or functions. But right now, just observe this, develop this skill. As you develop it, you will find that you can now switch emotions at will. There are 2 aspects to this, not only to come out, but then can you slide back into the wallowing state and then pull out again, and then slide back in, wallow a little bit, and then pull out again. Having done that a few times, suddenly that whole wallowing state of self-pity is so artificial, so fake, because you can bring it on at will and come out of it at will, and you say, it's not worth it. Just having done that frees you from the distorted enjoyment that it represents. Instead, now something of the buddhi's free influence enters the sense mind. And now the same problem, you start thinking about it. Okay, I have this problem. What can I do about it? How should I proceed? What's the right action? And the whole relationship with the difficulty changes. But you have effectively separated your higher from the mixed parts. Having brought that greater freedom, you can impose or influence with that greater freedom the lesser parts and change their patterns. This is a very important, I'll say, technique or practice. You don't look for occasions to wallow in self-pity, but when it does happen, you can exercise it. But in certain systems, and I won't use the word yoga, but they're actually yogic systems, even though they don't use that word, they would actually do this. In India, this was done indirectly through the training of theater, where the theater itself was made a means for a development of a deeper poise of liberation and equality of the self. The way the self puts on in each life a different personality and a different life experience. In the same way, on stage, you, not yet the true self, but still as a mind representative of the self in the buddhi, you put on a personality, a persona, play it out fully with full immersion and identification, and then step back freely and switch it. As an exercise, it gives you a tremendous capacity of control over these lower parts, but also the ability to separate. And with the separation comes a greater freedom with which you can modify, reprogram these habitual responses. So now we come to the observation of the Buddhi proper. Let's say we have sufficiently separated. We are aware of ourselves as this conscious intelligence, will. It can stand back from all these experiences, choose freely a free action. In this itself, there are three. Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase stages or elevations of functioning. So this distinction is not found anywhere in any system, because it is not relevant to a system that wants to discard the mind. And even modern psychology does not recognize the actual separation of these powers. They just reduce it to independent faculties of one mind. That's not how it is. They're actually layers, and the layers are vertical. The lowest part of the Buddhi, intelligent will, we will say, is the part which Sri Aurobindo calls loosely current understanding. So I will read now from some of the portions, just because I want to highlight the phrases here, and they're extremely important to fully appreciate. He says, it has a habitual, customary action, which is a link between the higher reason and the sense mind. A kind of current understanding. So you may call this a lower reason. Above that are the two other layers of the Buddhi, which will be called higher reason. But this is the customary mind, habitual, and it takes the sense mind's habitual knowledge, but gives to it the ability to stand back and review and modify. Nominally. And so this has a very important role. It is a witness, but as a witness, it is dependent on what the senses provide. And the large part of its thought process is tied to what the senses offer or the values that the senses have of life. So most of humanity actually lives in this. They don't turn to, why am I here? What is my larger purpose in life? That question comes higher up. Here is what's the value? What's useful? What is helpful here? What are the relationships that benefit me? What relationships don't? I've seen people sometimes, as long as they needed you, they were fully engaged, and then the next moment their work done, click, they switch, and then that's it. It's as if you didn't exist. And you wonder, don't they have feeling at least of some empathy? You built a relationship, at least I thought they had built a relationship, and then switch, it's gone. And this is generally possible when they live in a layer like this, which is very pragmatically oriented, but the emotions have been trained to follow this higher operation. They don't really give much value to their emotions, use them as tools, which is okay. It's a kind of a higher freedom, but it is used now for a very inferior value system of the Buddhi. So it takes the working of the higher reason and turns them into coin of opinion and customary standard of thought or canon of action. So you input and output. So there's a values of thought, and then what is the principle of your action? Always do this way, never do that way. You have these very common sayings. In business, trust but verify. Okay, there are no friends in business. There are many things I've heard over the years. I don't agree with many of them, but still there are things which people have formed as their bylines or their slogans by which they live, and it belongs all to this level. He says it is not capable of itself forming pure thought and will. It has thought and will, but it is largely representing what the sense mind offers. Now comes the interesting thing. This is an exercise which Sri Aurobindo recommends, or which one needs to do if you really want to master your operations of Buddhi. When we perform a sort of practical analysis of the thinking mind, cut away this element and hold back the higher reason, free, observing and silent, we find that this current understanding begins to run about in a futile circle, repeating all its formed opinions and responses to the impression of things, but incapable of any strong adaptation and initiation. As it feels more and more the refusal of sanction from the higher reason, it begins to fail, to lose confidence in itself and its forms and habits, to distrust the intellectual action, and to fall into weakness and silence. Observe this, very interesting. You will immediately recognize that this is one of the practices which are often recommended in yogic traditions. Stand back from your own thoughts until they run down, because they have no more any purpose left and they become still. Who stood back? From what? Well, this is the understanding. This is, well, the habitual mind, the lower part of the reasoning. The higher reason is what stands back. And it has the ability to not be bound to this. It can say, I refuse to engage. And this is the habitual part which loses confidence and fizzles out, becoming silent. So he says, the stilling of this current, running, circling, repeating thought mind, is the principal part of that silencing of the thought, which is one of the most effective disciplines of yoga. Practice this. But in practicing this, observe what the two layers are. Well, eventually there'll be the third. But this part which stood back and this part which was running around helpless. And when you do this, you stand back. The first thing often happens is all the thoughts rush around. And it is this layer where you have this rushing thoughts. And they jump all over the place. Oh, I didn't make that call. I need to clean this. I forgot that I was to do that work. I was supposed to buy this. I was supposed to talk to X. All the things come which you had forgotten. Precisely because you pulled back the higher Buddhi function. And now this lower grade of current understanding of the Buddhi is the one which suddenly pops up into activity. Observe this. Stand back and stay until it runs down. If you have already done what we had earlier discussed as practices of equality or opening to the descent of peace, this part has got somewhat habituated to becoming quiet on demand. So the moment you stand back, it stills. If you allow yourself to lapse in identification, all the activities start. I found sometimes when I was in deep concentration in a work, my mind is fully engaged on a very crucial, let's say, thought or action, deep analysis, to a point where I've forgotten myself. If I disengage a little bit, I notice, oh, there's this part in which a mechanical song, which I had heard 20 years ago, is going on. Why did it come? Where did it come? I don't even know. It popped up from the subconscious and it's going on. I can ignore it and get back to my function. It does not change. I can still focus fully. But why is it there? Why can't it be quiet when I choose to? Okay, you step back, will it to become quiet, and then re-engage. And maybe something else pops up. So there's a culturing you will do. But this is the layer, and that is the higher layer, which separates from this habitual part of your current understanding, customary action, which is the link between the higher reason and the sense mind. Work on this separation first. In certain ascetic traditions, this is given a very objectivized form of practice, where you're told, don't think too much. Stop asking questions. Monkey mind, stop activity, become quiet. And one of the ways to do it, you're put under charge of somebody who has higher authority, maybe even higher knowledge or wisdom, and you have to serve blindly without questioning. And they will make you do things which seem to be irrational, but you have to do them just accepting. So it forces the whole consciousness to become passive to some higher authority, which is, of course, objectivized, external, but to be passively receptive and just obey quietly, but always turning to the higher. It's useful, as everything is useful, but it has severe drawbacks, because while you may do that in form, subjectively, you have never really removed the questioning part. You have only learned to suppress it or ignore it. It is much more useful to turn internally, observe this, and then learn to quiet it directly, without any external authority, which may not always be true wisdom. You make this clear, and then from here you can open to the higher consciousness, which will be closer to a truer wisdom, eventually to the highest wisdom. But this is just to explain some of these strange practices which you see in many traditions have a rationale. They're an attempt to objectivize subjective processes, but the subjective process is not done. The objectivized form of it will be only partially useful, and mostly it will also create passivity in all other layers, which is not what we want, which may be good in the ascetic tradition, but not good for us. But we understand how an external form of practice could be made with always severe limitations. Now, we come now to the second layer, which is the beginning of the higher reason, the first of the higher reason, and then the third layer, which is the second level of the higher reason. So I'll just speak of second and third layers. All this is higher reason. To this, Sri Aurobindo gives the name pragmatic reason. And I will again read his introduction to this. He says, but the higher reason itself has a first stage of dynamic, pragmatic intellectuality in which creation, action, and will are the real motive. And thought and knowledge are employed to form basic constructions and suggestions. So in this layer, you have thought and knowledge, and then you have creation, action, and will. These are in front. The thought and knowledge are only there as suggestions or to help organize these, which are which are used principally for effectuation. Even the thought and knowledge is turned to how do I implement. To this pragmatic reason, truth is only a formation of the intellect, effective for the action of the inner and the outer life. So to this part of the Buddhi, layer 2, there's no such thing as an absolute truth. Truth is only the position your mind takes, your intellect takes, for purpose of action. What do I do? What is the right thing to do? Oh, that's the principle. Okay, how do I translate it into action? No dwelling on the deeper sense of the principle stated. Straight away, how do I implement? Now you can see this power is extremely important, especially for a yoga that seeks to manifest the divine. It is extremely important, but it has this severe flaw. It does not pause even. It is always in a hurry to translate into action. I caught an idea before even the idea has fully unfolded its message. How do I translate? What's the take home? So he says, this pragmatic reason can originate, progress, enlarge the experience by dynamic knowledge. So the still higher range, which is the highest level, the third level of the Buddhi, is primarily focused on knowledge. If that is separated, this part only turns to implementation. But now the problem is, how does it decide if the higher Buddhi is cut out? How does it decide what is right? So he says it has to depend on the current understanding, this first level of the Buddhi. Using it as a pedestal and a base and puts the whole weight of life on this. It's very interesting to observe this layer. It either turns up and receives a higher command from the third layer of Buddhi, which has true knowledge or seeks true knowledge, or it turns to the lower pragmatic side and says, how do I make my life more pragmatically effective? Now you'll see the bulk of humanity which has evolved the Buddhi sufficiently into its own is living on this. Now that's already a minority. Those who live or have developed the Buddhi enough, that's already a minority. Within that, the bulk of them are here. Turning to improving my life. Look at the bulk of modern civilizational achievements. They never think about what's true, what's right, what's good in the longer term. Most of our problems which we have with the climate or destruction of environment or poisoning of environment, carbon dioxide is not so serious. Poisoning of environment is most serious. Nobody talks about it. Nobody thinks about it. You have factories all over the world right now at this moment per second producing millions of tons of chemicals to be sold for profit, which is wonderful. You should have a profit. You should have a successful business and production. Those chemicals are needed. But nobody stops to think, eventually, where do those chemicals go? Eventually, they go back to nature, and we know they are poisonous. Can we make them less poisonous? Can we reprocess, recycle, or withdraw them and ensure they don't go into our soil and water? No one thinks about it. Because this pragmatic reason is only interested in enlarging its current experience. Extremely useful, but fatal flaw in a sense. It is therefore, he says, mind of the will to life and action. Much more a mind of will than a mind of knowledge. But in progressing and changing aspects of truth, always today's truth is different from yesterday's truth. Tomorrow's truth will be totally different. You don't stick too much to truths. Just see what's needed now and implement. And so he says it can give us no firm foundation and no fixed goal. At the highest, it can help to grow and progress, and that's about it. When we do free it from the customary mind below, the level 1 of the intellect, we have to separate this also. Coming into awareness of this, you separate from the first layer of the Buddhi, and now we find it becomes a great creator. Because it's not serving a lesser ideal, it can serve a higher ideal. And strong channel and bold servant for the effectuation of truth in life. The form it took practically in the ashram, let's say, when people of this capacity and this temperament were selected by the mother for executing projects. She gave them the ideal, she set the goal, she set the standard and demanded that they live up to it. And so they were forced to move out from their, convenient zone. There was a person who was very practical in this way with this part of the mind. And mother used him for building large parts of the ashram. And at some point, he came up with this idea, mother, we have a woodworking unit, let's make coffins to sell. Imagine Sri Aurobindo ashram manufacturing coffins. What a ridiculous idea. But it was not there. It was following a practical intelligence that he had. Oh, this is very profitable. Let's do it. And of course, mother used him also for all kinds of other achievements. In fact, what happened is when Sri Aurobindo left his body, he was assigned to build the box in which Sri Aurobindo's body was to be interned. But there were other aspects to that whole story. But the point I'm making here is, it does not by itself turn up. You have to consciously turn. Think about it. As you become conscious of this part within you, look for lasting, higher, permanent truths. And this part turning to become a servant for those higher and permanent truths becomes a strong channel and bold servant for the effectuation of truth in life. By itself, he says, it is a sport of time and bond slave of life. And so, those who seek silence, withdrawal from life, they have to simply silence this part and throw it away, which is what is done in certain ascetic traditions. But for the seeker of the integral divinity, he says, has to pass beyond it to replace and transform this thinking mind by greater effectuating spiritual will, the truth will of the spirit. Now, at this point, I'm going to pause and stand back and look at this whole operation. Third level is pure knowledge, and we'll come to that shortly. Second level is this will that turns that knowledge into effective action. First level is the lowest, turning to habitual stability of forms and values. Between these three, you can see how it makes for a complete effective action in life. The lowest holds what is built up, the middle translates into action, and the highest conceives of higher, greater, purer, lasting truths. And the second translates, the third holds forms of translation. Think about this. It's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes. On every plane of consciousness, in every part of the human functioning, there are multiple layers. or rather, there's a sevenfold functioning within each. You see the 7 planes, which each represent different principles, are all reflected within each plane. And within each of those subplanes, all 7 principles again are found. This is a very important idea. It is a Vedic principle which is Sri Aurobindo refers to a few times. Of the 7 planes, remember the linking between the higher Satchidananda and the lower mind, life, body is the supermind, which knows oneness and multiplicity, and so can link the two. Well, in the operations of our mind, the Buddhi is that linking principle between the higher and the lower. In a sense, it is the delegate of the supermind organized within the domain of finitenesses and superficial reflected appearances. It is therefore also the key as vehicle, because the powers of the Buddhi correspond to powers of the supermind, but operating in reflected and finite functions. In other words, the Buddhi itself is the organizer in mind, the way supermind is organizer for the whole of reality. But also the two are connected. It's as if the Buddhi, as it opens up and turns to supermind, becomes now the link point through which the supramental powers can effectuate themselves. And these 3 layers become corresponding to 3 powers of the supermind. When you think of it in these terms, your Buddhi, your intelligent will, is something so sacred, so important. It's the link point which is going to organize in the finite appearances. But it's also the link which will open to the higher spiritual realm, which will then come and transform and divinize the whole of the mind. In human evolution, in a general way, speaking of the mass of humanity, the awakening of this is the current phase. In the higher ranges, more refined or more developed in evolution of mind, this is the part which has come out enough that it can begin to act on its own. But it's still in the 3 levels of its operation, it is still largely in the first and second. The third is rare, very rare. Even in those who take to philosophy or science, which would require you to find deeper truths, it's not there. One of my friends was studying in Australia in philosophy class he did, I think, 2-year course of philosophy. And he discovered Sri Aurobindo while in between. So eventually he ended up leaving the class. But he would bring what he read from the Life Divine into the philosophy class and counter-argue anything which the teacher threw at him. And the teacher was lost. At some point, the teacher said, no, but it's like this, and this is what so-and-so says, that is what so-and-so says. So my friend said, but aren't you interested in what is true and not what people say? And the teacher said, no, that's not our job. Our job is to just collate such and such a philosopher says this, another says that, and we teach you what they have said. That's all. But what is true and what is real finally? No, not important. So although the functioning required you to seek for higher and real truth, not important. So a large part even of philosophy, science, as scientists, including theoretical scientists or artists, musicians, sculptors who would also be seeking something higher normally, are just turned to this first level or second level, pragmatic or the implementation of a life, what he called mind of will to life and action. And that's it. Very few really turn to that first level of the Buddhi and seek for real lasting truth. So now we come to this description proper. Sri Aurobindo describes it as a mind of knowledge. The third and noblest stage of the intellectual will and reason is an intelligence which seeks for some universal reality, what is true everywhere, or for a still higher self-existent truth. Is there something which is true irrespective of what happens in the world? Things may change, forms may change, but this remains. Self-existent truth for its own sake. And then turning this into action. It's not that this is passive. Turning this into action tries to live in that truth. So this is primarily a mind of knowledge and only secondarily a mind of will. It has a will, but the will aspect is secondary. You see, in the supermind, in the true supermind, knowledge and will are united. You bring that power or that principle to organize in the domain of divided consciousness, which is the domain of mind. So will and knowledge also split. Will becomes with knowledge. You can never totally split. So will is with knowledge in the level 2. Knowledge is with will in the level 3. They're always together, but the dominance of one or the other changes it. For action, it is dependent on the aid of the pragmatic mind. And so the moment you turn to the pragmatic mind for action, that is level 1, remember, of the Buddhi, then you fall away from the truth. You have a high truth. The moment you turn to implement on a pragmatic level, you lose the way. It gets distorted, or the implementation is half, it's partial, it fails. Now you can blame circumstances, you can blame people, you can blame lack of resources, but really the problem is your vehicle for implementation was insufficient. But that was the only vehicle you had. So you tend to fall away from the purity of the truth. This disparity between knowledge and will is the principal defect of the human Buddhi. Now you see everywhere in all these workings within the overall Buddhi itself, knowledge and will are completely different in their operations, needing different vehicles, different means, and therefore you can never get true knowledge turned into pure, perfect will. Or the moment you move into will of action, you've lost the link with the knowledge and there will be a distortion. And therefore the need to go back and forth and switch between the two. This is flaw of the way the human mind works. This is not a problem in the supermind. And therefore when the supermind fills the mind, it lifts it and inspires these different layers by its unified knowledge will, that division is healed. The correction is for this mind with its layers fully developed and turned to be led by something in which knowledge and will are unified. And then you can have the perfect smooth action. There is also another problem which it can have is it can find itself ineffective. I don't have the means to articulate or to express or to manifest in life that which I know and I live in, because it depends on other parts for that. Or if it loses itself in the lower customary functioning of mind, then it just finds itself bound into fixed ideas, very idealistic, but bound in narrow, rigid forms of ideas. So much of religion has formed this way. A higher truth touched or even held for a while in an individual or a group of individuals, the moment it was brought down, it had to use these lower ranges of the consciousness of mind, even of the Buddhi, and there got sucked into customary forms and patterns and limiting judgments. So for this part, the method for us to purify it is to release it as much as possible from this habit of limiting opinion. At which point there is the demand of the pragmatic mind for immediate effectuation. I've got an idea and that next layer says, I need to act on it. And you're pulled by the lower layer unless you free yourself. You're pulled. And he says, it gives it no time to proceed to larger truth, but fixes it by the power of effective realization in whatever it has already judged, known, and lived. So many great spiritual teachers or people who had potential to be great in their realizations, and surely of their teaching perhaps, cut short their higher development because they turned to express, to teach, or to form communities, disciples, and so on. I've shared in our discussions on this, in this series earlier, example of somebody who's very famous today, who I met, and I had gifted him a book of Sri Aurobindo, and he said, normally I don't read other people's books, but Sri Aurobindo I respect, and he took it. And then I asked him, because I had read his description of his experience of cosmic consciousness, and I said, do you have access to this at will? And he said, no. It comes only when when it is needed for some reason, or I have to transmit it to somebody else. So I said, why don't you spend time to deepen into this experience so that you can live in it all the time? He said, if I do that, then I will not be able to do what I'm doing with my disciples. Think about it. The priority to build a community, have disciples, and manifest whatever partial experience was there had overwhelmed the possibility to go deeper and form a more solid base. Even if you needed to create a following, it would have a more solid, stable base. But the demand of the pragmatic mind for immediate effectuation pulls the whole of the Buddhi, including these higher parts. You see, if you think of Buddhi as one whole, you don't realize these three layers have very different pulls and pushes and demands. And so whatever happens in the Buddhi, you say, that's my Buddhi. No, that's one layer within your Buddhi compromising another layer. And that's why the distinction between these layers is so important. Let's say now you free this level 3, the highest level, from all these limitations by the means already discussed: stilling, quieting, removing old habits, and so on, freeing it completely from the lower influences. Then it has its own inherent limitation, which I had already mentioned last time, which first is all your realizations are mental, whereas the truth itself is of a higher grade. And so this layer now has to open to the intuition and receive more and more the intuitive truths. At which point the intuitive truths acquire a mental form, clothing, ability to articulate in thought and then turn into action. And so this layer is essential for that. But it must turn now to seek from still higher. Or it gets stuck with another inherent problem. It is, remember, a vehicle of finite pieces. It looks at the truth and sees infinity. Or if it cannot see infinity, then it sees infinite pieces, because it can only see pieces at a time. How do I turn those infinite pieces into practical form? I need one piece, but there's too many possibilities. So this is inherent to this part. Again, if it yields, becomes quiet and opens out, it can get a glimpse of the infinite. And then if it allows the intuition to translate into an inspiration, the inspiration takes a form. This is how it has to turn. And it flows. And the mind becomes the link, the Buddhi becomes the link, the vehicle for translating into knowledge, and then into effective will, and then into forms, including customary forms which might be modified or changed. Otherwise, it looks at that greater thing and says, I don't know what to do. It becomes helpless. And it may hold a great truth, but unable to translate, because it is bound in ignorance as a vehicle itself. You could, of course, choose in the ascetic tradition to silence this and then merge into some higher status, but then you don't have a linking consciousness. So you go into a state of trance, which might be blissful. You come out, you have no memory of the bliss, except as a reflection, and that's about it. You go back, you come here, and there are two different worlds, increasingly separate. Again, not very useful for the purpose of our evolution and the purpose for which we were born. So we have to, as practitioners of the integral yoga, try the rarer adventure of lifting the soul from the mental being into the spiritual gnosis. And for that, the first step is the intuitive consciousness, of which we have already spoken of much, even including practices for this. And this link made with the intuition and through the intuition to the higher infinity of the supramental consciousness, the link made, that higher consciousness can form through this mind as a link now to flow into all the lower ranges. This becomes an intuitive or illuminated mind, is the phrase Sri Aurobindo uses. And the first derivation of the supramental can form here, which will have both knowledge as well as will, as well as culmination in forms, as flowing in a stream from the inspiration. So I think this will complete what we had to do for purpose of training the Buddhi. And we have done some superficial stimulating exercises, but also suggested many more, which you can do on your own. The key really is becoming conscious of these distinct layers within the working and how they mix into each other and influence each other, separating the mixtures more and more, coming into your own as pure Buddhi, distinguishing between the three operations or levels of the Buddhi, again separating them and opening the whole to a higher intuitive influence. And this is the work to be done. If you want to really develop your mind to make it an effective, powerful instrument for the divine consciousness to stream through without distortion. What you see in Sri Aurobindo is perhaps the most extraordinary example. And as Kapali Shastri said, he represents the most highly evolved mind possible in a human body. But that highest evolution of mind is all the way to the supramental consciousness. And yes, we can hold it in a physical vehicle. And you can see in the way he describes, the way he writes, the way he articulates, goes precise, straight to the core of things, places everything in perfect right relation, not just in knowledge, but in articulation of the knowledge and then in execution. It's complete. And this is the example before us. This is how we have to become. And we have no excuse to say, but he was. No. He was in a condition more difficult than yours if you really read what he had to say about his nature and the difficulties he had to go through. All the human problems of nature were there and you overcame those. And now he is there to help you. So you have no excuse. Not all of us may choose to consciously develop and refine all these levels. If you do, it will create a more effective instrument for the divine to manifest. If you don't, they will still be lifted and purified in time to a lesser or greater degree of their capacity. But the divine will then work through a limited capacity. Not all feel called to develop these layers. Follow what you feel at this moment, and maybe it will change later. Follow what you feel at this moment to be your immediate priority. Develop in those. Review. Remember, it's a multifaceted path. Simultaneously, many different lines of development. And each of these converge into each other to form a very rich, multifaceted development. And you'll be surprised, especially when you take to the central method of the integral yoga by the action of the mother's force in you. You'll be surprised how rapidly these layers will be clarified, purified, and even distinguished between each other. If you have this background, you'll be able to notice and observe and participate. And that makes it totally worthwhile. So I think this will complete our discussion on purification. And next time we will take up the discussion on liberation and the two aspects of liberation itself. You can take a moment to review and assimilate.